just want to tell you a story about Thursday night. I went to this veterans fundraiser, and the keynote speaker was this guy who was a veteran, I think, of the Afghanistan war, and he was telling the story of how it might have been an IED or a grenade had impacted near him and took off a chunk of his face and his body. And he told the story about how over the course of months, medical professionals and other members of the military and nonprofit community worked together to reconstruct his face and body, save his life, and give him the opportunity to stand on that stage. And it should have been an inspiring moment. But as this guy was speaking, I looked around my table, and over half of the people at the table were staring at their phones. And I peeked over to the woman next to me just to see what she could have possibly been looking at. Maybe she was anxious about the election, and that's what was captivating her attention, which still wouldn't be great, but it would have been better than what I saw, which was that she was picking out furniture. And I mention this because uh, this is a symptom of something larger going on in this country. There's something deeply wrong with where we are right now, and it goes beyond our inability to pay attention. It has to do with what we do when we're not paying attention to what's in front of us. Like, yes, our ability to recognize when we're standing on holy ground and when we're in the presence of greatness, right? That is one thing. And that certainly was missed by a lot of the people at my table. But on the other hand, it's like, well, what do you like when you're missing what's in front of you? What are you doing? And more often than not, the answer can sometimes be horrifying. So I want us to rediscover our capacity for reverence. And this is a gentle reminder as I start this podcast that sometimes the most radical active living is just being all the way here with each other. And in that spirit, I'm going to tackle some of your voicemails and try to be present with you. Before I get there, let me just give you some quick observations that I've collected over the past few days. These are in no particular order, and I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit, but all centered on this question of the election and the coming Trump administration. So, first observation here is that the Democratic Party is decimated. I can't tell you how many people have called me who are veterans of Democratic politics and of the administration who said they've had enough and they're out. In some cases, this is good. Like, you know, you need a changing of the guard in order to make major change. But in some cases, some of the most talented people out there are going to leave. And that worries me deeply. A related point is this is the end of the Obama era of Democratic politics in terms of especially the talent that we have. A lot of the folks from that 07-08 campaign and then the 2012 campaign, folks that I know very well, they came in and were integrally involved in the Harris campaign. I don't know why I can't say that word. And a lot of those folks will not be running campaigns ever again. And in many ways, as I described last week, you know, the way that we ran campaigns back then is just not how campaigns are run anymore. And what we are going to need are people who understand this new media landscape in a fundamentally different way than the folks who are running that campaign, who are running rallies that were meant to get local TV coverage. And, you know, we can go on and on and on, who are writing speeches that were meant for a different era. Like the era that we're in now, politically speaking, is much more messy, much more disaggregated, and demands a different kind of politics. Relatedly, a friend of mine told me the other day, who's a veteran of the Biden administration, said, I'm worried that there's going to be so much focus on learning the lesson of this past election and that we won't be skating to where the puck is going, to use a Wayne Gretzky phrase, meaning that the world is changing and what the electorate is looking for could be different 4 years from now. Inevitably, it will be different 4 years from now than it is today. And I think he could be right. I was getting a lot of calls from people who, you know, want to solve this man problem that the Democrats have. And I think we're going to get a lot of cringe out there from Democrats and Democratic aligned groups. Like we're going to get more of the equivalent of the camo hats, you know, the Harris Waltz camo hats and the white men for Harris type of solutions. You know, these very cringeworthy solutions to deeper problems. And I think that the problems Democrats have with men and many other groups bridge the culture and policy divide. I think culturally, Democrats just don't understand, or at least elite Democrats don't understand the culture of both the internet and communities that are out there, like the combination of YouTube, Instagram, podcasting, but also just what it's like to live in small, medium-sized towns out there, and how people view Democrats. They probably are out of step with even what's happening in bigger cities, as I described last week. They also, I think, um, are going to over index on the policy here. We're going to talk to people on this podcast like Richard Reeves, who have a lot to say about both the state of the trajectory for men and what Democrats could do about it. But the policy part of this is just such a small part of the equation. But I worry that Democrats are they're gonna grab onto the policy because that's how they think. Democrats are, didactic and try to reason their way through challenges like this. Whereas I think this is in many ways a cultural and emotional phenomenon as much as it's a policy phenomenon. On the Trump side of things, a senior Biden official told me, and he was there for the last transition from Obama to Trump. He said that the Trump folks this time are taking transition much more seriously this time than they did before. And I think this gets to the best and worst case for the Trump administration. I think when you talk about, if you just take your partisan hat off for a second and say, well, what's the best case scenario for Trump in terms of cementing his legacy and the dominance of Republicans, it would be a lot of the tax cuts on tips and overtime, stuff like that, that's geared towards lower income service workers. I think it would be very popular with, for instance, like the Latino workers who in some ways are drifting more towards Republicans. You combine stuff like that with more radical change on the education front that we've talked about here on this podcast. I think a lot of stuff like that could create some real problems for Democrats whose solutions are often very complicated, and that even when Democrats are passing bills that help people like the child tax credit or the Inflation Reduction Act, people don't really connect the dots between that policy and Democrats. Sometimes there's just a lot of messiness between the policy and the people that Democrats aim to serve. Whereas a lot of the stuff that Trump is talking about is pretty simple for people to understand. So I think if he does a lot of that kind of stuff, he could be doing a lot to cement Republican dominance in years, maybe even a decade plus to come. Where the risks come is with some of the more dramatic policy proposals that he floated during the campaign, the more extreme versions of tariffs, the more sweeping versions of deportations. Like those kinds of policies combined with even some of the tax cut measures that I just described could be highly inflationary, right? If he takes the tax cuts on tips, overtime, and more sweeping tax cuts, including on the most wealthy, combines it with tariffs and deportations, that will have inflationary pressures. And that's not even getting to if he tries to pressure the Fed to more quickly and aggressively cut rates. If it's not obvious, deportations can be inflationary if it hits workers in society who keep service fees low, right? Like if we deport not just, I think they're saying it, the worst are first is the way that the Trump administration is talking about deportations, meaning they're starting with people who break laws, et cetera, or came here more recently. But if they do as they promised on the campaign trail, to have more mass deportations of people who are working in the service industry all over this country, then the costs of those services will go up. And if you combine that with tariffs, tax cuts, and pressures on interest rates to go down, everything will get more expensive. And I think at that case, this sort of bargain that Trump has struck with voters about being better on the economy will fall apart. And that's where I think some of the other things that are risks for Trump, like pardons for January 6th, which I think we can expect, him comporting himself anything resembling like he did on the trail, those types of things people will put up with if the economy is doing well, but they will not put up with that if the economy is not doing well. One last piece here to look out for is internal dynamics within the Trump administration. I think the most important of which is J.D. Vance versus the Trump kids. A smart political observer told me over the weekend that they view, I said, well, it's obviously going to be Vance next time around. And they said, well, don't sleep on some of the Trump kids, including Trump Jr., and watch out for a civil war within the administration between some of those kids in Vance. And this came from somebody who's more Republican leaning. So I don't claim to know Republican politics really well, but that is definitely a bit of palace intrigue to keep on your mind. Uh, as for this show, I had some travel that I had planned before the election. It's not connected in any way to the outcome of the election, but I will be traveling more and will be on uh, a less regular cadence. So we're not going to be doing the 3 or 4 episodes a week like we did before, and so you could expect a bit of a slowdown moving forward. And I'm going to try to focus on topics that extend beyond short term politics. But even when I do discuss politics in the Trump administration, I'm going to focus less on the politics themselves than on policy, kind of like those early days of the Lost Debate show before we got into the heart of campaign season. So, a good example would be, for example, how we would treat the debate over tax cuts. Um, some people will say, okay, like it's about the politics. It's smart to give away as many tax cuts as possible because people politically like to get tax cuts. But the way we'll cover it is through the perspective of what's good for the people receiving the tax cuts, but also what's good for the long term fiscal health of the country, regardless of the politics. And if they don't do offsets of the tax cuts, then that would be bad for the deficit, which is something that we care about in this podcast. And it doesn't cut any one way politically, right? What I just described could mean that we're probably going to be pretty hard on Trump if he does sweeping tax cuts without offsetting deficit work. But a good example that could cut the other way is if they follow through on some sense of reforming Social Security and Medicare, right? Some people would say that's dumb politics. They call it the third rail of politics. But if they raise the retirement age, that might be tough politics. But as we've long said on this politics, there are few alternatives to making this government solvent. And people are retiring later and living longer. When Social Security was first passed, men lived to the age of 61 on average and women 65. It would make sense to revisit those retirement ages. So even if it's bad politics for Trump, if he decided to do that, I would probably be pretty generous in my analysis from a moral and policy perspective. We will always mention politics here, but we're just not going to make it the core of what we do. We're also going to move beyond mere anecdotes. We're going to spend a lot less time talking about what's happening on Twitter. I, for one, am mostly off Twitter for the foreseeable future. I'll probably go on here and there just to share stuff that's happening on the podcast, but I'm not going to be regularly reading or commenting on anything on Twitter. One last point here is a matter of emphasis. I'm going to treat Trump with the same level of scrutiny that I did Biden. You know, when Biden won, I started this podcast in a way to try to create a place to be as objective as I can possibly muster. And try to deviate from some of my friends in traditional left-wing media by mercilessly critiquing Biden when I think he screws things up, but praising him when I think he does things right, and doing everything in between. And we're going to apply the same standard to Trump. And I say this particularly because those of you who support Trump need to hear it, which is that his victory gives him the presidency, and he deserves that. And I'm glad to see Harris and Democrats concede with grace. But winning the presidency now means that you are welcoming all the scrutiny that the highest office in the land commands, and that a victory in an election doesn't validate everything you ever said or did, and certainly doesn't make you immune from criticism. It actually makes you much more vulnerable and open to criticism, and that's what we'll do here moving forward. And so with that, lots of great voicemails and messages we've gotten. Let's jump in. Here is one about the question of shame.
Life after this election, well, I suppose this is life after Trump, whether he wins or loses, needs to involve making shame relevant again. I don't mean shame in like a dogmatic sense. I mean shame in the common sense. Trump and his party have gotten a collective pass for lying, separating families, endorsing Charlottesville, gaslighting America on a deadly virus, stealing secrets, watching the Capitol burn, and never being able to respond to criticism because, gosh darn it, they just haven't had a chance to read the tweets or see the videos. There need to be consequences to outrageous actions. Right now it feels like we're lawless in spirit, and I feel like sometime soon, lawless in practice.
So this reminds me of a clip that's going around the internet from Chris Cuomo, which he says something like, Americans who supported Trump don't endorse his behavior necessarily, but they view the presidency as a dirty job, and they're willing to support a scoundrel of sorts to get the quote unquote job done. And I've been thinking about that clip a lot. And actually, a lot of people have sent it to me, including some of you in the audience. And my general feeling is twofold. One is I actually think that Cuomo could be onto something in terms of the psychology of people supporting Trump. But my question will be, what is the job you view Trump, like what job do you think he's here to do? If you think the job he's here to do is to quote unquote clean up Washington, meaning like throw the bums out, the people who, profit off of stock trades while they sit in Congress, or who are too cozy with big business while they're regulating them, et cetera. I would ask you to pay very close attention to what the Trump administration is doing, right? There's, already speculation that they're weakening the ethics rules of people who come into the administration. You can watch, like, whether it's the flow of campaign money and other money to members of Trump's inner circle, like the equivalent of what happened with Jared Kushner and the Saudis, right? There will be a lot more of that, I think. And the question is Washington getting more or less corrupt under this administration? And then there's like, well, what other jobs are you asking him to come in and do? Well, for some people, like a lot of my friends in Staten Island, it could be the border and immigration. I actually think like it's pretty likely that you're going to get a much more restrictionist border policy. I probably disagree with some members of our audience about how good some versions of that will be for this country, especially if Trump moves forward with some of the more dramatic versions of the deportations. But again, we'll see. Like there's a version of it where Trump comes in and does targeted deportations, but not the most dramatic version of what he's described. And in that case, it wouldn't have the inflationary pressures. It wouldn't decimate small businesses in our communities. And it could lead to a more orderly process if he did it right. And again, I'm willing to wait and see and call it like it is when it comes. So we got another voicemail here about the example we're setting for children.
Ravi, hey, just listened to your prediction podcast, and what a roadmap you're setting out for your listeners as to how to navigate and manage this election and the results that come of it. As I think about my children and what do we do if what we want doesn't happen, and what example do we set for our kids? And man, you laid it out in a way that was heartfelt and it was refreshing. I haven't really been hearing anything like that. Listening to your podcast and your insight, and can't wait to stay on the journey with you. Thanks for everything you do. Keep it up.
Well, thanks for the compliment. This gets to, I think, the prior voicemail about, shame, and what the lesson of this is that I am not sure that the result of this election is that people are, well, first of all, I don't think a lot of people are taking my advice that I set out there, which is not to gloat and to, have a charity of spirit and curiosity with the people who voted differently than you, no matter what the outcome. I certainly don't see a lot of that out there. I see people in some cases being the worst versions of themselves, which we'll get to in some ways in this episode and certainly beyond. But, we're only a mere few days after the election. So my hope is that things cool down and we turn the corner at some point soon. But those are voicemails that we got before the election results. Let's get to some of the voicemails that we got after the election results. We got a few about the question of right-wing media. I'm going to play both of these clips. Here's the first one.
I feel that your 10 key factors was very interesting, and there's much good advice there, but I don't feel that you can discuss things that help pave the way for Donald Trump's return without a discussion of what right-wing media, what Fox News, what that has caused in our society, where you have two different groups with two entirely separate belief systems. And I know you mentioned grievance culture, but I don't hear. I know there's valid grievances, certainly, but the grievance culture created by Fox News has distorted reality and has allowed people to be so fearful. And I'm sure you know all this, but I think you have to have a. Are there any statistics that show how many people who watch right-wing media voted for Trump? That would be very interesting to see how they've created this base for Trump. Thank you.
So that's the first one. Here's a second voicemail on the same subject.
I don't think any of your points would have made a difference to people who watch, to the Trump supporters who support him because of what they learn on Fox News.
All right, so let me tackle both of these. I think this is related to, my first point in my sort of autopsy video, which is that I think that there was this advice that the Harris team and Democrats generally, and then before her Biden, were taking, which is you can't educate the electorate on the economy, et cetera, which is really outdated advice that comes from an era in which you had the network news and people had this sense of, balance that the news would bring. But now a lot of these media networks are partisan and don't view their role as objectivity anymore. And it's true of Fox News. It's true of MSNBC, right? And I do think that these are huge obstacles, and I do think that they do play a tremendous part in results like this, and certainly in the way that people view things like crime and the economy. Now, in my video, I was focused really on what Democrats could do differently. I don't, they can't change Fox News. What they have to do is build up better, more robust media companies, and also that there's a reason Fox News has greater viewership than MSNBC, for example. Why is that the case, right? But also, like, in the alternative media ecosphere, there are explicitly right-wing media sources like the Daily Wire, which to me seem to be running circles around more traditionally Democratic media circles. But then there's the alternative, non-explicitly political media. I would throw Rogan and podcasts like that, but also a lot of the health and wellness podcasts, comedian podcasts. And Democrats forfeited a lot of that ground to a lot of members of the, a lot of the right-wing influencers. Like Ben Shapiro, for example, is much more likely to do the rounds on those alternative media properties than John Favreau, for example, at Pod Save America. And I think that has cost us. And I think some of those alternative sources were way more gettable than, say, like a Fox News host. And a good example of this was when Bernie Sanders went on Rogan. He was getting so much shit for it, right? And I think a lot of Democrats didn't want to go on places like Rogan for a long time because they were worried that their base would get upset about it. This is a good segue into our next voicemail, which gets to this sort of podcast ecosphere.
Hi, Ravi. I really enjoy the show. I think it's fantastic. I'm a recent listener, or recently new listener. I was going to tell you about Brene Brown. I think you said that most people listening to Brene Brown really wouldn't be, they were already voting for Kamala Harris. But I can tell you, I actually live in Mississippi, and I have several friends that listen to Brene Brown that are very conservative. I think, and one of the things that also draws people to her is she's really staunch in her faith, and she's pretty religious, but also has some more liberal ideas. So I think I have several friends. I'm leaving it tight. This is hard. I have several friends that listen to her that are extremely conservative. I also have a professor from school who is Mormon, and all he does is talk about Brene Brown. So I think possibly Brene does have a few more listeners, or at least more fans of her books on the conservative side than maybe you think. And then as far as another thing I've been wanting to ask, I recently moved back to Mississippi. I spend part of my time in the Mississippi Delta and part of my time in Jackson. So I know that you had some experience in Jackson with the school systems, and I think one of the things I'm trying to figure out and learn more about is the failing school systems and why it's so hard to kind of make them better. Is it funding? Is it, oh my gosh, this is hard. But I think you've been drawing parallels of what you learned in Mississippi, and you draw parallels when you're having educational podcasts. But I'd like to know more about it, and maybe we could do a deep dive into Mississippi, and maybe some of the southeastern states and why some of those educational systems are failing so much. It hasn't really changed in the 30 years that I've been on this earth. And I would love to help out and know why. School choice is on the ballot and different, not on the ballot, but it's going through the House and things like that. People are trying to lobby for it. So not a very tight email, but those are my questions. Thanks. Bye.
Well, thanks for the clarification on Brene Brown. And I think that probably, let me revise what I said then. Maybe it wasn't a question of either or, but maybe she just should have also done Rogan. On the question of Mississippi and education, for sure, we'll be doing a lot more there. Love the great state of Mississippi. That is a state that has a lot of challenges, and it is a state that has a fascinating educational trajectory. And so I promise we'll do more on that in the future. Let's go to our next voicemail. This is a Harris voter who defends Trump.
First of all, thanks for the postmortem. That was probably the best one I've encountered. So I've never thought I'd be in a position to defend Trump, but, here we are. I voted for Harris because I think Trump is, compulsive and alarmingly vulnerable to flattery. But I don't disagree with all of his ideas. It's just his temperament isn't really what I'm looking for in a president. Now, that being said, I think you're right. Democrats and the left kind of had it coming. You touched upon this a little bit, but I think there's like an arrogance in the party and its supporters that is getting pretty toxic. There's no nuance anymore, and for most issues, like for example, wanting, stricter immigration policy and wanting to preserve a certain way of living doesn't inherently mean someone is, a racist or God forbid, a Nazi, but it's often framed as such among certain segments of the party. And it's important to remember, never in human history has society been right on every issue at any time. And, voters are tired of this sense of moral authority. You look at the COVID restrictions, and Democrats still haven't really come forth and apologized for some of it, even though I think deep down most know they went pretty overboard in many cities. Second, I think there's a pretty tangible privilege among the progressive left that is just not tolerable to voters in America. The party apparatus is so heavily based in academia and, cities like New York, DC, San Francisco, LA. So when voters hear, leaders from these areas pontificate on, fiscal policy and housing affordability, it falls on deaf ears. If most Americans can't live in these places, how can we expect to reach, people in rural Iowa that may not want, a Californian's idea of, fiscal policy. And the third is the hyperbole is getting just crazy. After the results this week, going on X was almost unbearable because you just see these bizarre takes like, we're going to see a genocide of transgender people or like calling even moderately conservative people like Nazis. It's just, this kind of language is irresponsible and like really diminishes the meaning of these words. And when you push these people who claim these things to back it up with evidence, what genocide of transgender people is going to happen? They really don't have specifics. It's just very performative and honestly getting kind of gross at this point. Anyway, I'll continue to vote for Democrats, but
So great voicemail. I often think about this as, what's the responsibility of Democrats and the sort of left and center? and what lessons do you draw from Trump's victory? There are some people out there, and I suspect Bill Maher might be one of them, who's like, I think his tagline from Friday was "Losers look in the mirror," and his point is all the things we're asking of Democrats, most members of the Trump coalition did not do after their last two losses, and this is where they got, because they were confident and they didn't apologize, and they just moved forward and created the reality that they want. And it's possible that Bill Maher is right. I can only just say that I constitutionally am I'm incapable of operating that way. And maybe the next leaders of the Democratic Party will be better at that. But I only know how to run organizations the way I know how to run organizations. And, after a day of school or after a school year, when we get results back, even if those results are really good, we would get together, we would look at the data, and we say, what could we do differently, right? And I think this gets to your COVID point, which is after that pandemic, I think there's a lot of simple narratives out there that cut in both directions. But I think if I'm just focusing on what Democrats should learn from COVID, I totally agree with you. I think the apology is one thing. Apologies, I think, are important in life, but you can't really take that apology to the bank. What would have been helpful beyond dispute, and something we've talked about, is that the party, if the party would have had a credible and robust and urgent plan to make up for learning loss, for example, that would have shown that they were serious about learning the right lessons from COVID. And with some exceptions, we largely didn't get that. And certainly we didn't see at the top of the national ticket any meaningful and urgent message on education. But again, like, I get it. Like, there are a lot of friends on the left and the center who are like, and this gets to the shame point, who their lesson from Trump is, let's stop apologizing. Let's stop saying we need to learn these lessons or whatever. They never did that, and look at how they dominated us. I just can't operate that way. And I will never be a voice for that approach, and this will never be the podcast for that. Let's go to our next voicemail from Simone.
Hey, Ravi, it's Simone, your pal here. I have to say, when I saw 10 key reasons, like a boomerang, right after I had fully just went all in on your prediction for a Kamala and early decisive victory, I was like feeling a lot of feelings that were challenging. By the end of the podcast, the 10 reasons why, I felt like there was just a really high level of analysis and emotional intelligence, and especially the accountability piece around, like, how did we get here, that I think is just so incredibly critical for how we plot our way forward. And always grateful, always appreciate. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Simone. I don't love that I made that prediction, and so apologies to the audience for getting that wrong. I got caught up in the last few weeks in the hopium, and I think a lot of what I was seeing from Trump, I just thought was so bafflingly horrible that I was like, he's throwing this thing away. And I think it's very possible that he would have won by more if he would have shown more discipline towards the end. And there's a lot of data out there about the general global anti-incumbent environment. There's this great article in the Financial Times, which basically shows, like, parties seeking re-election all around the world, how much ground did they lose versus the last election. And there's actually a lot of evidence out there that if you follow the global trends, Trump could have done a lot better in this election. And I think probably the delta there is just all the things that members of the audience, whether they like Trump or not, continually mention, which is his personal character, his lack of discipline, and some of the more incendiary things that he's promised, I think, still grate people the wrong way, despite all the issues people have with Harris and all the issues people have about the trajectory of the country in certain ways. There was always going to be a ceiling for him. And that is a theory I take very seriously. And like many other theories, I don't want to jump to any one theory right now. But again, I appreciate it, Simone, and I'm sorry I led you astray on Election Day. And I'm glad you're still with us, and I appreciate the kind words about our retrospective. All right, let's jump into another voicemail.
Hey, Ravi, just calling to give some post-election thoughts with a little bit more than 24 hours since we found out that Trump was going to win. I called back after Biden's debate and mentioned how he had not talked at all about the Supreme Court, and I do think that that was something that the Harris campaign might have missed an emphasis on, especially as we're looking in hindsight of a lot of people that voted without necessarily understanding what could be some consequences of a Trump term that they may not agree with, like an ultra-conservative Supreme Court. I'm also looking ahead to 2026 Senate elections, and it really looks like the only way that Democrats could ever hope to gain a substantial majority back is by investing in places like Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa, and potentially even places in the Deep South. We've seen the progress that we've lost in states like Iowa, but also the progress we've gained in Georgia, and those seem to be the only potential options for us to move forward and ever have a chance at getting a sizable Senate majority again.
Well, I agree on the Supreme Court. I said this, I think it was during the Harris-Trump debate, that I was baffled that the Harris campaign wasn't more forceful about the fact that a loss in this election means that we will probably have a right-wing Supreme Court for the rest of our lives, and never mind the appeals and district courts. And I'm almost certain that's true. And that gets to some of the things I opened this podcast about, which is this is going to lead to some dominance, right? Like the Republicans will have the Supreme Court, probably the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency now. And a lot of those they're going to have for a while, right? They're going to have the presidency and the Senate probably for at least 4 years, and the Supreme Court for the rest of our lives. And this is not a group of people who are prone to compromise and to any sense of grace. And so what that means is you're going to see some pretty sweeping changes. And on the other hand, any road back for Democrats is going to be paved with any oversteps by any of those institutions. But those institutions will make it harder to mount a comeback. Like you go from district courts to the Supreme Court, to the state courts or legislation. Like these bodies actually have some say in how we conduct elections, who can vote and who can't, how redistricting is conducted. So it's not going to be easy for Democrats. And unfortunately for Democrats, the most likely favorable scenario for them coming back to power would have to mean that this country really suffers. On the other hand, if Trump governs well, Democrats are going to be in the political wilderness for a considerable amount of time. But we'll continue to cover those dynamics. Let's go to Natalia from Staten Island.
Hi, Ravi. It's Natalia here from Staten Island. Just listened to your recap episode of Lost Debate. I think you summarized everything perfectly of what I've been thinking about the past few months. As soon as Trump won the primary, I knew he would win the national election. As Biden started to decline more, became more apparent, and then as soon as Kamala was chosen as the presidential pick, in my mind, the race was over. So I tried to disconnect the past month or so because I just couldn't take all the coverage and just getting really upset about things going on in the world. But I think you summarized everything great. The one thing I think you missed, though, was her VP pick, Walz. I think he was an easy target for Republicans to portray as weak. And I think the ticket already seemed weak just because Kamala is a woman, and that's how a lot of Republicans mostly, but even moderates and maybe even people in general subconsciously, think of women as leaders. And I think even though he has a good track record in the past, right now he looks like the, grandpa teddy bear, nice guy, doesn't really portray himself as someone who's strong and powerful and haters and actually, be a force in the room with them. So I think that was also not a good choice from the Harris campaign. I have my own thoughts on what they could have done strategically to win more votes, like pick Shapiro, from Pennsylvania and try to win that state. But, I just think Walz was overall not a very good choice and just, catered to more of the Democrats that were looking for more of the same and not really trying to get those moderates or, undecided voters. So that was just the only thing I wanted to mention. Thanks. Keep up the great work.
All right. Thanks, Natalia. Well, I think this is one of those questions that gets to what lesson are we trying to learn? And there's this sort of Schlesinger theory of history that my former boss, David Axelrod, quoted in this like seminal memo to Obama he wrote when Obama was first deciding to run for president, in which Axelrod said, anytime you have an incumbent president, a two-term incumbent especially, but any incumbent, the electorate often is looking to address what they view as the shortcomings of that president. So he said, for instance, whereas Eisenhower was old, JFK was young, whereas JFK was young, Nixon was old, Nixon was corrupt, Carter was this sort of this like, you know, religious, principled farmer, where Carter was weak, Reagan was strong, where Reagan and HW were old, Clinton was young, where Clinton was a philanderer, George W. Bush was about family values, whereas George W. Bush was a kind of creature of Washington and, you know, pro-war. We nominated the Iraq War change candidate in Obama, whereas Obama was this sort of sweeping rhetorician who was technocratic and elitist to his critics. Trump was an outsider who spoke like the common man, right? Like, so you get the picture. So the question is, let's use this test of 4 years from now, where's the puck going? Nobody knows, right? But if you're the Democrats, and in many ways, there's not much to be done on some of these questions yet. But if you're thinking about who's going to do well for Democrats 4 years from now, it will be somebody who addresses what voters may be fed up with in a Trump-Vance administration. And I say this because if the Trump-Vance administration is flying high, well, then there's going to be very limited room for Democrats. But if Democrats are to be addressing something that voters find frustrating with a Trump-Vance administration, well, what is that? And it's hard to say, but here's one possible scenario, which is if some of the dynamics that I talk about, 4 years is a long time, if the economy is not doing well and Trump is being Trump, then again, just like 2020, when Trump lost last time, the voters could say, you know what, I want somebody different, somebody who's a little bit more disciplined, somebody who is kinder, right? So you could see it actually cutting the other way, right? They might not want a strong man. They might just want somebody who is like Pete Buttigieg, who's like, you know, extends a level of grace and kindness and openness to people who are different. On the other hand, like there are versions of that story where, yes, like people could be looking for a strong president, and it could be because Trump is so old that they view him as weak, which is always a possible scenario. But again, it's not, I view it as not where we came from, but where we're going. And I certainly hope that we're not writing off any women candidates in the future just by mere gender, because I think the answer to bad identity politics can't be more identity politics, right? I think this gets to the Walls pick that you were talking about. There was this sense out there that the Harris campaign had to pick a white male because Harris was a black female. And I always thought that that was wrong, because I think people are people, right? And they're not just their identity. And I hope that moving forward, that is the standard that Democrats use. I do agree that Walls in hindsight, and maybe it was apparent at the time, I was more of a Shapiro guy. I think he didn't bring a lot to the ticket. I don't think he was like a crazy liability. I just don't think he added much to the ticket. But thanks, Natalia. And, you know, keep your head up out there in Staten Island. Let's go to one more.
Hi there, Ravi. I want to start by saying I deeply appreciate your podcast as someone who was probably too emotionally invested in this election. It's really brought me back down to earth, so I appreciate that. Something I wanted to address that you touched on, where you're deeply confused by catchphrases or quick kind of ways to flatten certain issues like Black Lives Matter and Leave Women. I realize that it's not so flattened. However, I see the importance of these as someone who was confused by Black Lives Matter when it was first a slogan and was an All Lives Matter person, it forced me to dig into why they were saying something like this. And so for me, as a woman who had to grapple with sexual assault, listen to women was deeply important to me as someone who just kind of went through my life and I would just swallow anytime I was violated or anytime something that wasn't so much like a black and white case of something I could report to the police. It became a movement that really shifted how people listen to women. I realize it's not so simple that people like in politics can just lie and they happen to be women. It doesn't mean listen to them. But just as a general shifting of perspective, I just wanted to bring some light on that. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for this message. For me, I always separate the slogan from the sentiment, right? And the sentiment that you're sharing here, which is that we were out of balance, and if I'm being honest, I think we're still out of balance in many segments of society, is real. How you address that, I think, is the harder question. I think of Black Lives Matter, to take as an example. I was somebody who went down south to North Nashville, the neighborhood with the largest incarceration rate of Black males in the country, served kids down there, and then went to Mississippi and started Second Chance Studios during the height of June 2020, which was a nonprofit to help people who were coming out of the prison system land jobs. I always took seriously the need to fight for racial justice in this country. But I think both the Black Lives Matter slogan, movement, and a lot of the people who are putting up black squares and participating in some of the worst elements of the protests in June 2020, including people who are vandalizing businesses and also trafficking in ideas from anything from Robin DiAngelo's white fragility to Ibram Kendi's anti-racism, that they were doing real damage to the people I really cared about. Because sometimes their slogans were incomplete. Sometimes the ideas were both incomplete, and sometimes they were just totally counterproductive and wrong. And they were born out of this sort of grass tops, affluent white society version of what they think black people were looking for, and that they were, the people like that I think actually have really important voices. Like there are people like Ezra Klein, for example, who I think is a really smart podcaster, but who at huge periods of time during all of this were pushing the ideas of people like Ibram Kendi, which is a elite white person's idea of what black people want. And I remember there was this debate between Sam Harris and Ezra Klein, and candidly, I think Ezra Klein kicked Sam Harris's ass in this debate, even though I happen to really like Sam Harris, and I was probably more prone to believe what Harris was saying in the debate. But I think just as somebody who was trying to call balls and strikes, Ezra Klein owned him. But in the service of that debate, Klein said to Harris at the end, he's like, I think you really need to be reading from more people and inviting more people on your podcast like Ibram Kendi. And we've talked about Kendi on this podcast before, and I think he is of the ilk of Robin DiAngelo. These people who believe that every white person is racist in some way, and that the standard for being, anti-racist or a good ally is an unreachable goal that you have to constantly strive for. And we can spend more and more time on those ideas, but to me, it was a recipe for alienating people that you want to be your allies, and was also a method of speaking that was cloaking the language of the movement in indecipherable sociological gobbledygook speak. In some ways, people trying to be as confusing as possible to sound smart, as opposed to actually try to solve problems. And I think the proof is in the pudding. It's, if you look at the legacy of Black Lives Matter, and even of Me Too and other movements that we've seen over the years, it's hard to say that the results are there, right? It's hard to say that we're better off in policing now than we were pre-Black Lives Matter. where a lot of these people like Chase Boudin are, came in and actually, in some ways, fully alienated the public from any idea of reform, and that what we have is a backlash against like really sloppy ideas and sloppy ways of talking about people. So I share your goal, which is to ensure that nobody ever is in a position that you're in, that men treat women with respect, that people who commit, um, sexual violence and associated crimes are put to justice. I worry that some of the work that we've done and some of the stuff that people on the left have done has actually made it harder to accomplish those goals. And some of the biggest misogynists in society today are as emboldened as they've ever been. There is this tweet out there by, this woman who tweeted that she quoted people saying, Kamala supporters are crying. And she said, that is women mourning their future and dads crying for their daughters. Do not piss me off, she wrote. Andrew Tate, the sort of serial misogynist and alleged sex criminal, tweeted back at her, or what, bitch? What happens if we piss you off? The men are back in charge. This, rhymes with some of the language that we played from Tucker Carlson, where daddy's coming home or whatever. And again, I think this gets to a bit of hubris that I see from the other side. And it makes me really sad that this is the language that dominates certain segments. It certainly, I would not want to paint with a broad brush. I don't think that sentiment describes all or even perhaps most Trump supporters. But those are folks that, whether you're a Trump supporter, a Harris supporter, or somebody who voted third party or didn't vote at all, like we got to fight against that because those people are emboldened right now. Well, a couple other comments that we've gotten. Here is a voicemail on the Bridget Fedesi interview that we had.
Hey, Ravi. Just calling in to kind of let you know, like, my opinions on the conversation you had with the Trump voter. I understand a lot of what you guys were talking about. It's more like if you're going to vote for somebody, regardless of the politics, because, I mean, I lean more Republican most of the time because I'm a small business owner. But in terms of morality, I guess is maybe a good way of putting it. Like, I lean Democratic. I mean, voting for Trump is just not an option for me as a young black male that's been called the N-word multiple times by people waving Trump flags. By acting the way Trump does, he's saying this kind of behavior is okay. And I saw that increase. Like, I probably got called the N-word like at least 7 to 10 times this year alone. And I've never had that happen at that frequency. Like, maybe once or twice, like, throughout the year, maybe. But, like, definitely not this much. And definitely not in a place like Colorado. Not only that, but, like, Boulder, Colorado. It's wild. But anyway, outside of that, like, tax evasion, just calling women derogatory names, like you're by voting for somebody like that, you're saying that kind of behavior is okay. And while I haven't been a big fan of my Democratic options, I have to use part of my vote to say, like, character choice matters. Like, I'm not going to allow Apple CEOs to act that way. I'm not going to let any other CEO act that way and, like, still buy their product. I wouldn't let, like, my kid, if we had kids, talk that way. Like, I know I'm kind of rambling, but that's just kind of where I'm at, is your vote also says what's okay character-wise as well. Thanks for all that you do. It's been fun listening to you. Looking forward to new episodes. Have a good one.
Well, first of all, I'm really sorry you had to go through that. And I think this gets to something I've been worried about for a long time, which is I do think the character of the person in the Oval Office really matters. And often that person is a role model, right? That is, we're giving somebody the most powerful job in the country, probably the world. And how they conduct themselves tells kids and people out there in our country and our community how to act. And I know a lot of you who vote Trump don't agree with me on this, but if you think about, how is Elon Musk conducting himself and talking to people out there? How is Trump conducting himself and talking to people? Matt Walsh, you go down the list of the people in his orbit. If you listen to this podcast, even if you like some of those policies, chances are you don't love that conduct. And it's on all of us to decide what happens now that Trump is president, right? The election is over and Trump won. But in validating a person for that office who acts the way Trump has acted, there are real risks out there. There is the risk that people like our listener are going to hear from more people saying demeaning and hateful things to them. There is a risk out there that adults treat each other fundamentally differently because some norms have changed within our society, right? That the way that you and I converse, or the way that you converse with a person in your community and certainly online, the rules of the game have changed, and maybe they changed before this election, but we all have a responsibility here. So if you're a listener out there and you hear stuff like what this listener just described, or anything even approaching it, regardless of who you voted for, like, the words matter, right? Like we've discussed on this podcast, like what's violence or not, right? Like, and whether words are violence, and we've had that discussion or whatever. But putting that all aside, like, we believe on this podcast of being respectful to people in your community and being just generally nice, right? Like, that's what this podcast is for. Like, this is not the podcast about owning the libs or owning MAGA, or demeaning people because of their politics and their beliefs. And I think it's going to be on all of you as listeners to make sure that we don't backslide so much that we truly lose ourselves. A couple other comments that we got about this Bridget episode. I think one really stood out to me. One person wrote on Spotify, if she is the best person you could get to represent the Trump vote, we can see why he won so big. Look, and I take it this is from a Trump supporter. Number one, don't be a sore winner. Like, don't whine after you've won. I'm talking to a friend of mine who voted for Trump. There's no one Trump voter. There's no one Harris voter. And this happens to be somebody who I've been on our podcast before, and she's been on this one. And she tweeted out that people don't invite her on their podcasts who are left leaning. And I tweeted at her saying, well, I have. And it prompted me to say, you know what, just come on and we'll talk. And she represents one person who voted for Trump. Let's not get carried away, right? Like, if this commenter is as a supposed Trump voter, let's abandon the grievance now. You control all levers of government. Let's not be heat-seeking missiles for grievance. Enjoy your victory. Stop looking for people to somehow wrong you. Bridget is one person who presumably voted the same way you did, and you should be pretty happy about that. But we'll continue to talk to people who are Trump supporters. We actually had more than you think on this podcast in the past few months and weeks. A good example is Ann Bauer, who we had the conversation about estrangement. We deliberately didn't go to what her particular politics were, but the subtext of that was that she and I actually had very different politics, but saw the question of estrangement very similarly. And there were plenty of other people, and we'll continue to have conversations with Trump people, independents, traditional conservatives, Democrats, etc., because that's what we're about. All right. We also had some comments about my analysis about Crooked Media and Pod Save America. As a recap, I was pretty hard on Pod Save America and Crooked Media in my post-mortem, saying that they were irresponsible in the way they talked about Biden's age. We got a comment saying, I usually respect your analysis, but I don't think you need to dig at the Pod Save America guys. I respect them and don't suspect that they completely understood what they were seeing. People, Biden, are allowed to have bad nights. They brought it out publicly when it mattered and pushed for a change. Are you really telling me 2 more weeks matter here? Then we got a comment from a different listener who I think sees it differently. Said, thank you for bringing up the Pod Save guys. I love their shows. I consume a lot of Crooked Media content, but I specifically remember when they started talking about Biden at that fundraiser and contradicting themselves. And I was like, wait a second, am I misremembering what you just said? I think there's a fine line between keeping morale up and flat out gaslighting, or for lack of a better term, and we need to do better. So competing thoughts about Crooked. Actually, the guys at Crooked had something to say about Biden's decision not to run just this past few days. Let's go to this clip.
Joe Biden's decision to run for president again was a catastrophic mistake. It just was. And he and his inner circle, they refused to believe the polls. They refused to believe he was unpopular. They refused to acknowledge until very late that anyone could be upset about inflation. And they just kept telling us that his presidency was historic and it was the greatest economy ever. We just heard him again say that it's the greatest economy ever. Clearly, 70, 80% of voters don't believe that. They don't believe that about their own personal financial situation, but they just keep telling us that. And then after the debate, the Biden people told us that the polls were fine. And Biden was still the strongest candidate. They were privately telling reporters at the time that Kamala Harris couldn't win. So they were shivving Kamala Harris to reporters while they told everyone else, not a time for an open process, and his vice president can't win, so he's the strongest candidate. Then we find out, when the Biden campaign becomes the Harris campaign, that the Biden campaign's own internal polling at the time when they were telling us he was the strongest candidate showed that Donald Trump was going to win 400 electoral votes. That's what their own internal polling said.
There were polls showing 80% of voters thought Joe Biden was too old to get a second term before the debate. And then we all watched the debate. And then in the last few weeks, Biden was campaigning, and he said, we need to lock Trump up. He created a controversy over whether Trump supporters were garbage. He said, the weird thing about slapping Trump on the ass. Like, his moments on the campaign trail weren't flawless either.
You cannot.
It's absurd.
It's absurd. Trying to be generous here.
I'm not. I'm done being generous.
I want to stay for the record. I also think all the TV money ads should be.
Those should be rethought too.
More importantly, the idea that Joe Biden was going to do better in this race than Kamala Harris is on its face absurd.
So I can't really argue with a lot of what they're saying. The problem is there isn't a lot of looking in the mirror here. Like, these are guys who, I mentioned the fundraiser, right, or in and around the debate, but it goes way deeper than that. The problem is, throughout all of the primary, they were minimizing Biden's age. And I could play clip after clip after clip of these guys saying all kinds of things about how it was too late every step of the way to bring in another candidate. And if you just want one artifact to listen to truly understand how complicit those guys were in Biden running again, and how meek at best they were in trying to do anything about Biden staying in the race, go back and listen to the interview they did with Dean Phillips, who is, to remind you, the one Democrat really to jump into the race if you don't count Marianne Williamson, a probably run-of-the-mill member of Congress who ran and was really elevating the question of Biden's age. He went on Pod Save America, and this is a podcast that does not give critical interviews for the most part, and they gave him a really hard time, and you could listen to it. And what you have here is like an example of a pretty successful media company who at no point until it was really too late, which is post debate, really never at any step of the way wanted to speak truth to its audience. And I think it's a much more dramatic version of what I was saying about Ezra Klein too. Like this, we talk about the Biden age question, which Ezra actually was good on pretty early, Ezra Klein. But these guys, if you take all the bad ideas that I talked about, by and large, you talk about all the questions around racial justice, identity, politics, right? Gender. These guys were on the wrong side of so many issues and largely caved to the most extreme versions of the left, and at no point were pointing the party in any direction. And they had the largest voice. And I personally like a lot of these guys, but I do think they're out of touch. And I think they run their company as a business, not as some kind of, benevolent entity that's meant to make the world a better place. And I think in some cases they're captive to their very left-wing employees and audience, and speak to that grass tops, super affluent version of the party, and have missed many, many big problems that the party has had with their base. A good example is, I think it's the Hysteria podcast. You can go there and listen to the way they talk about education, charter schools, ESAs, things like that. This is a network that has largely been out of touch with their base. And I say this as somebody who's partnered with them before and considers them friends, but we've got to be honest about this, right? The entities like the Daily Wire were running circles around Pod Save America. And they really have to answer for that, just like these campaigns have to answer for what they've done. And, I think it's one thing to just get things wrong. Like, do you predict this or you predict that, or do you advocate for this policy or not, is one thing, versus are you fundamentally being dishonest with your audience, and or are you bending to pressures, whether they're financial pressures or, your, your progressive bona fides pressures, instead of doing the work that you're here to do, which is try to be honest with your audience. And I think too often they've gone the wrong way there. But I think those guys are a little too online, a little bit too captive to the affluent segments of the base of the party. And I think we need new media entities out there. We need people who are willing to speak more truth to power. And I know a lot of you who listen to this podcast, first of all, come here for that, and I appreciate that. I know there are also other entities out there who position themselves to speak truth to power, and I think some of them are on to something more than others. Like, I think if you're listening to this podcast, you like to find contrarian entities, and I think there are certain entities out there that are like, I would put the free press there, which like sometimes write really interesting articles, but I would call the sanctimonious contrarians, right? Who are the type of people to be like, I told you so, whether they got 2022 wrong or 2020, like, which way they're going to say this election was going to go before it happened, which is they get no penalty for saying Trump is going to win this election, because if he wins, then they get to say, I'm in touch with the working people. And if he loses, they will say that the margin could have been more for Harris, if not for insert all the different critiques. Too much focus on transgender people, identity politics, yada, 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 yada. And actually, we have a lot of common ground, me and these people, on some of these issues. But where we depart is in the I told you so element of it, and how online people are. Like, so many of the people in that world are curating these anecdotes of people like Katie Porter, who have said like rather crazy and hyperbolic things after the election, and say everything's going to be fine. I'm getting texts from a lot of my free press folks on that kind of stuff. Everything is going to be fine. Trump is not Hitler. And I'm like, I don't know why you think I need to be the audience for this. Like, I think there's this sense that they get off on being the level-headed, rational people, while all the people on the left are losing their heads. And that's a very online conversation, and you could have that conversation with those folks. Obviously, this was a big part of what I was talking about with Bridget. Most of us in the real world are really focused on tangible results. And I think it's a little simplistic to just say to people, everything's going to be fine, Trump is not going to be Hitler, because that's sidestepping like real questions around how Trump is going to govern. Like, if you're a Ukrainian, for example, or you're somebody who's undocumented in this country and you're worried whether you're going to be on that list of people who's going to be deported. If you're somebody who has any stake in any of the Supreme Court decisions that could come down, or if you're somebody who has a business that could be subject to tariffs, we can go on and on and on and on. Or if you're that listener who, as he described, is being subject to more unkind, hateful behavior, you're somebody whose president really does matter. And we spent the past 4 years saying we weren't taking seriously the feelings and the vibes and the way people felt about the Biden administration, never mind the actual real world policy impacts of, for instance, the rising cost of goods, right? We have spent the past 4 years taking seriously the impacts of those policies, and being told that not only should we take seriously the impacts of those policies, but even if the impacts from an aggregate level from all the studies that we see are actually heading in the right direction, we need to get at people's feelings, right? But at the same time, we turn around and say, okay, if you have certain feelings about this election, then we're actually going to caricature and make fun of you. And in that sense, I think that's short-sighted. I think it's inconsistent. And it also makes me not trust you as a media entity. Because, yeah, you're the cool kid sitting in the cafeteria making fun of how everybody takes things too seriously. But out here in the real world, who's president is actually a serious thing. And although, like, we can cut the hyperbole, we also need to look at things with a clear eye. And I hope that some of these entities turn the corner on this kind of stuff, because I think what happens here is pretty serious. So, and then again, like, let me say one last time. Predicting a presidential election, which is a 50-50, 60-40, 70-30 event, does not make you Nostradamus, right? Everybody needs to settle down, move forward, and, look at this administration with as clear eyes as possible and with as much humility as you possibly can muster. With that, please continue to send in voicemails. I really appreciate hearing from all of you out there in the community. Our voicemail is 321-200-0570.